Welcome to the L&D Explorers podcast from GoSkills. On today's episode, we talk to Dr. Clark Quinn, the founder of Quinnovation.com and a renowned expert in the field of learning experience design and development. He joins us to discuss learner engagement, and we'll talk about the importance of engagement, how to keep our learners engaged throughout a program, the importance of feedback, and what we can learn from game design to inform our L&D efforts. I'm Dan Gorgone, course producer for GoSkills. I hope you enjoy this discussion. Hey everyone, welcome back to the L&D Explorers podcast. My name is Dan Gorgone. I'm the course producer with GoSkills. Joining us today is Dr. Clark Quinn. He is a consultant, an author, keynote speaker with many years of experience in the design and development of learning experiences. So we're talking about games, apps, tools, and so much more. So we're very, very happy to have you here, Dr. Quinn. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Honored.
The topic that we're going to talk about today is learner engagement. And for the purposes of our discussion here and for the the benefit of the audience that's watching it, let's define learner engagement before we jump into it. So what are we referring to when we talk about learner engagement? Is it interactivity? Are we talking about course completion rates? What kind of engagement are we referring to here? How would you define it?
So for me, learner engagement is much more than just interactivity. We see these trivial forms of engagement. We'll see click to see more, which is just a way of dumping more content in and making people have to work to consume it. It's not thinking deeply. It can also be, points and leaderboards, substituting competition, hopefully to get people more motivated than the material. And I want to focus much more on the intrinsic engagement that says, why should I care? I would really like to have an experience at the end of the learning. Well, at the beginning of learning, at the introduction, to go, I do need this. And I don't know it. And this experience will change that. If you have all three of those, I suggest you've got a commitment that the learners will invest the cognitive effort and to pay attention to the material and to apply what they're learning to situations you provide them for. So to me, engagement is much more about an emotional commitment to the learning experience, the intent to learn, and that includes cognitive immersion. Interactivity is necessary, but it has to be the right type of interactivity.
That's a really wonderful point. The emotional connection there that you have to strike with your learners right off the bat. I've been involved with many courses over the years, and so many times one of the things that has been recommended, both to me and then I'll recommend it to others, especially the marketing people, is when you're describing this course, when you're promoting this course, you've got to include the what's in it for me factor for the audience.
But that's absolutely right. Too often we just assume learners know why this course is important, and we don't address that explicitly. And that can be at anything in K-12, higher ed, corporate learning. And when learners understand why this is relevant to them and what it's going to enable them to do afterwards, as you said, the WIFM, what's in it for me, we have that commitment. In cognitive science, we talk about cognition, affect, and conation. And cognition is typical stuff we care about in instructional design, which says we need to present the right information, we need to provide practice. We don't do a good job of this according to learning science, but that's a separate problem. Affect is who you are, and it's not learning styles, but it is sort of a personality, and that's sort of fixed. It seems to be immutable. But conation is really interesting because that's your intent to learn. And what we want to do is get people intending to commit the effort to learn this. And self-determination theory is from DC and Ryan, were the researchers who've led that initiative. And my colleague Matt Richter has been really, for me, a communicator of that perspective. They talk about getting people to feel like they have a choice in what they pursue, in being supported to achieve competence, and recognizing that the rest of the environment, the other people and the design and from the designers is focused on helping them achieve that competence. And when you put those together, you get the opportunity to get people to intend to learn. And you're absolutely right. We see it too seldom. It's not just the marketers, it's the designers, right? From the get-go. You should have them going, I do need this.
Yeah, the last thing that we want to do is make any learner feel like they're forced into some kind of learning. And that certainly goes to the designers, the marketers, but especially the L&D professionals who are designing a program, putting something together, perhaps at the request of the higher ups who want certain things. And we certainly don't want our courses to feel like, well, in the end, it's the 2 hours of continuing education that I'm required to do per month. And so the next month I'll have another 2 and blah, blah, blah. So, we really want the best case scenario. We want that interest. We want people to really be ready to dive in because they know that the course has something of value for them. So with that being said, how do we engage learners from the very start beyond the, what's in it for me copy about the description of the course, and by the end of this course you'll be able to X, Y, and Z? How do we engage them right from the start?
Well, to me, it is partly that what's in it for me. But what you need is a visceral reaction that says, I don't know this, and this would be valuable if I know it. If you can get that reaction, and you can do it humorously or dramatically, in other words, you can poke fun at not having the knowledge, or at somebody not having the knowledge and somebody else having it, or you can do it dramatically. Michael Allen used to have on their site, on Allen Interaction site, this flight safety video that flight attendants have a safety checklist just like pilots do, but they weren't performing it, and they wanted to get them committed to it. And so they had a disaster scenario where the plane takes off and it's flying and it has to land on the water, and they go to inflate the rafts and there's no air in the inflators. And suddenly there's this dramatic, and the notion is, after that, maybe you do recognize that this may be something worthwhile. We can even do this with compliance. There's a reason we do compliance training. Everybody hates it, and it's because it's just done as information dump instead of saying, why is this important? What should people be able to do as a result of this that will keep them safe, our company from being sued, keep our customers and clients safe? There's reasons. We just have to make it manifest, but we have to be willing to spend the effort to understand. We did the series e-learning manifesto a number of years ago. Michael Allen, Julie Dirksen, who worked for him and wrote the fabulous book Design for How People Learn, Will Thalheimer, one of our great translators of research to practice. And we said, what's the difference between typical e-learning? We were in the e-learning space, so that made sense. Almost everything we said is relevant to learning in general, not just e-learning, but face-to-face. And then we talked about what was serious e-learning. And amongst those things was showing that people should be driven by engagement. It shouldn't be easy for authors. It should be engaging to learners, meaningful to them. And that's, to me, a really important element that says, I connect. And then once you've got them hooked, and it is, again, I mentioned 3 things, because sometimes you can have people going, I need this, but I know it. And they don't. You wouldn't have designed the course if they didn't. So you may have to slap them upside the head in various forms, like having them try and demonstrate that they know it and fail, and then they may be more open to learning. But they also have to have the belief that what you're going to do is going to change that. Otherwise, they're making me do this, but this is just going to be the same old garbage. And we have, I would suggest, as designers, our industry, not necessarily you or me, but our industry tends to have created an outcome that people don't trust is going to lead to any meaningful change, because we're focused so much on, let's make sure they know content. And in a cognitive science, we call that inner knowledge. Study it, pass a test on it, you go out in the real world, won't even get activated because you've never applied it.
Well, you mentioned a few ways that you can grab the learner's attention, the audience's attention from the beginning, either in a humorous way or a dramatic way, something like that. And as you said, hit them upside the head with some knowledge or scenarios, things that will really make the case that this learning is important. How do you maintain that though throughout the course? Because you don't want to keep hitting the same pain point every time, and it's like, yes, I understand. I need to know this. Fine, let's go. How do you maintain that motivation throughout the course as the learners continue?
Well, in a sense, you've made a promise. When they believe that they need to know this and this experience will change it, then you have to deliver on that promise. And that isn't, as you say, repeating the same message again. It's putting them in it's giving them models that they recognize are relevant for. That's more on the cognition side, but they can tell that you understand what they need to have. And then you show them examples that are interesting stories about how somebody faced a situation they immediately recognized was, oh yeah, I can see that that's something that would be really nice if I can deal with it. And they show how the model does it. And cognitive research by John Sweller shows, boom, if you give people examples before they practice, they actually do better, learn faster than if you immediately throw them into practice. But then your practice similarly has to put them in a situation where they go, I recognize that type of situation I really wish I could handle. And have you given me enough model? And it's got to be, there's a number of elements that have to triangulate. You need to have the right setting, the right context. You need to have the right level of challenge. It can't be too easy that is boring. It can't be too hard that is frustrating. You've got to have it pitched in that zone where people are engaged. It turns out there's a wonderful alignment between what makes people engaged and what makes effective learning. In fact, Rolf Koster, who was a game designer, wrote a book called A Theory of Fun, talks about why what makes games fun is learning, which is really cool for our purposes. Learning can and should be hard fun, but we have to spend that effort to make sure we're getting the right stories, the right level of challenge. And the feedback matters as well. It can't just be right or wrong. We have to tell them why it was right, why it was wrong. But if we get all this aligned so that they see that they are facing challenges that are meaningful to them and are pitched at the right level and they're having the right level of success and they're getting feedback to improve, they see that the designer has cared about their development of competency. And there's a number of other elements. You need to make it safe. If they
Hmm.
fail and it gets held against them, what I call the Miranda organization, anything you say will be held against you in the organization. Nobody's going to give their best. But if you make it safe to fail, so they're willing to try different things and experiment and explore, that accelerates the learning. So when you get that, all the elements working together to create an experience, and that's why I like the label learning experience design instead of just instructional design. Structural design done properly includes this, but it's too easy to just focus on a linear process and focus on the cognitive and not include the emotional. And I think learning experience helps highlight the role the emotion plays. And we actually have evidence that when people are motivated, they learn better.
Mm. Well, you just mentioned there, well, you mentioned a whole bunch of things there, and I want to dig into all of them, but you mentioned there the cognitive load and of going through course, and that's something that designers and need to consider the amount of information, the amount of effort, especially that mental effort that's going on inside a learner's head as they're going from section to section. Uh, I mean, some learning experiences vary. Can vary very wildly. They can be a coffee break, or they could be a week-long intensive workshop. So as you're designing these things, how do you keep in mind that idea of the cognitive load and knowing that you can say, build in breaks or build in sort of milestones for people? Like how do you give people all the things that they need without overloading them?
And I actually not sure it's that hard to keep cognitive load in mind. I think it's
Mm,
hard to have the time to deal with it properly. So
mm,
we may recognize we can't load the learner with too much, but to do that properly, we will make our first best guess about the right level of difficulty for that first practice and that second practice and that third practice. And we also need to worry about the context that they spread enough to support transfer. But we'll make our first best guess, but it won't be perfect. And I really worry about waterfall design approaches. If we build it, it is good. No, you make your first best guess, but then you test it. And so I like the iterative design approaches like Megan Torrance's Llama or Michael Allen Sam or um, uh, I think David Merrill's going there with this pebble in the pond. We're beginning to get iterative processes that say you create, and particularly you focus first on the core practice, and you get that right. And then you supply it with the least amount of models and examples necessary to succeed. And there's a number of things we do wrong. We have unrealistic expectations of how long it takes us to create a good learning experience. And there's no testing, right? You get it right the first time. No, humans are too complex. Don't have as predictable of properties as cement or steel. We're really variable, and you really do need to make your first best guess so you're not wasting a lot of time testing and refining over things you could get right from the get-go. But it's that fine tuning that matters, and we should be expecting that there's a little bit of tuning. And so by testing and tuning is how we get that cognitive load right. We make our first best guess. We find out, this was a little too complex. This was too easy. Let's ramp it up. We can accelerate it, shorten it. And when we get that right, then we have a much greater likelihood of having the outcome, the impact on the learner's ability to perform, and therefore the impact on the organization that we need.
One other thing that you mentioned previously was the role of feedback in this learning experience for learners. So there are plenty of asynchronous learning experiences where learners, they sit down, they lean back, they watch videos, and they might pop in some questions to multiple choice, answers to multiple choice questions, things like that. And there's not a great deal of feedback coming their way. It's more of assessment of knowledge, things like that. But at the same time, some organizations may not be in a position to provide feedback. They may not have the knowledge internally. They may have brought in something from outside and presented it and said, this is the best that we can do to help train you. So where do we, are we looking for the balance? Is that what we're looking for? Like with all things, we're looking for balance. We're looking for a good medium ground when it comes to providing feedback, really helpful feedback for learners when they're taking a course, when they're in a learning experience, because, in addition to applying what they have learned and practicing it on their own to really understand what they're doing, that feedback can be so valuable. So what do you think?
First, if you don't know enough to give the right feedback, you should not be producing the course. You literally have to understand it well enough that you can teach it to others. And if you don't, you shouldn't pretend. Now, you raise a couple good issues, and I want to thank you for bringing it up, because I didn't mention one of the first things you should do with feedback is give them consequences. Show them the outcomes of what they've done, because that tells them how the whole world works. We should be providing them with models that explain how the world works, and we should providing examples that show how the model is used to make good decisions. A good model lets you say, if I do this, this will happen. If I do that, that will happen. This is better than that. Let's do this. The feedback needs to reinforce that was the right choice or the wrong choice based upon the model. But first, see the consequences of the world, because that shows you how the world works as well. So you give them the consequences, then you give them the feedback. Fortunately, I used to rail against tools because they used to exist that only had one piece of feedback for all the wrong answers. That's ridiculous, because your alternates to the right choice should reflect the mistakes people make. We don't make largely random errors. We occasionally do. There's a little bit of randomness in our architecture, which is evolutionarily adaptive, but most of the mistakes we make are patterned. We're making mistakes based upon models we're bringing in that are inappropriate. The feedback helps, but you have to, if you've made the alternatives things that people get wrong, you have different feedback for that way of going wrong and this way of going wrong. So you should make sure that people hear that. And other than that, it's minimal. It shouldn't be personal. You're an idiot, unless the character first says that, because they're rude and you're teaching interpersonal skills of dealing with nasty people. But there are situations, everything has an exception to the rule, right? But by and large, you shouldn't comment on them as a person. You should show them the consequences and then give them feedback on the model about why it was right or wrong choice. That's part of making that safe. But you have to understand why it was right or wrong. And if you don't understand enough to know the way people go wrong and why they do, you really can't be designing effective learning outcomes, approaches to develop their ability to perform. And you really should be thinking, what do they need to be able to do after this? And that's what should be in the examples, and that's what should be in the practice. And they should recognize, yes, this is what I need to do. Otherwise, you end up back at that inert knowledge situation. There was some research done by Pooja Agarwal, who was a student of Roediger, who was one of the co-authors on the book Make It Stick, which is a really good book about taking research on what makes learning stick and translating that into practical recommendations. But she was a student, and she found that asking low-level questions, we have this belief that you need to ask questions to make sure they know the knowledge before you give them the challenge to apply that knowledge in situation. Turns out that's not necessary. In the situation where you're having them actually apply the knowledge, they have to retrieve it too. And she found that if you just ask those high level application questions, that leads to as good a performance and quicker than asking the low level questions and the high level questions. And it was far more effective than just asking the low level questions. So we can stop asking all those knowledge checks, which don't do any good. We should be making people ask questions and ask them to apply that knowledge in the ways they'll have to apply it.
I wanted to ask you something because in our discussion here, you've mentioned so many aspects of learning design leading to engagement that just feels like game design to me. And I wanted to ask you about the parallels between learning design and game design, because certainly gamification has been not just a buzzword. Yeah, there you go. I see you're already railing against it, but the gamification of learning has been like a buzzword or a technique or a strategy, but that certainly brings up the questions of, well, what does that mean? What does it mean? You add points, you add ribbons or things, badges? What is the real goal that we're trying to achieve there? And so it seems like there are so many parallels between game design and learning design that it's worth kind of asking you, since you're the doctor here, uh, what are the overlapping themes here, and what can L&D professionals learn from game design that can help inform their designs?
I didn't even, pay you to say ask this question. My first book was about how do you design games for learning, and it talked about some research I did back when I was an academic before I became an independent consultant. There has been a long history of exploration of games for learning, and they find that when you do it well, and there also was a bad period in the 80s. A bunch of people were producing games, and they put game designers, instructional designers in a room together, and what they came out was effectively chocolate covered broccoli. This was not fun, right? It was just not good. But before then, there had been some really great examples. I really remember Robot Odyssey, where were trying to escape the city, and you had these robots, and you built circuits to make them respond in particular ways so that they could deal with the obstacles faced in getting out of the city. It really intrinsically required you to apply that knowledge in ways that made sense. And that, to me, is what we're looking for. And when I say Ralph Costa wrote a book on games and points out what makes it fun is learning. If you think about it, you get it to a new level in the game, and there's these new NPCs you have to combat, and they have new tricks that you have to master to beat them. And there's a test at the end. It's called the boss, and you have to apply those tricks you've learned to overcome the boss. And when you do, you've demonstrated you've now mastered this competency, and you move on. We can do that with games. And my most recent book, Make It Meaningful, was about taking those principles from games and saying, how do we apply it to the design of learning experiences more broadly? But there are lots of things look at the beginning of games. They have tutorials that are story driven, but you play Legend of Zelda and somehow you go into this hut and there's this guy who teaches you how to use your sword. And it fits into the story, but they're getting you to master the basic skills so that you can then move on, and then they can start adding complexity to it. We should be taking a lot from this. And there's this alignment between what makes effective education, what makes engaging practice. And I had 8 elements that, and 8 is more than my short-term memory can keep track, even though I should know this for cold. But it's about, meaningful goals and the right level of challenge, and you care about the problem that you're solving, and the problem you're solving is real application of the knowledge you need to learn. And it goes on and on. And it turns out that's what makes effective education and what makes engaging experiences. When you put those together, you have to understand that alignment or you will mug it up. But if you understand the alignment, you can reliably, repeatably design learning experiences that are effective education and engaging. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Can you tell I get wound up? I'm passionate about this. So you can, if you have the resources, can create learning experiences that are really effective and learners go, oh yeah, this was transformational, not just instructional.
And it's nice too when you can, build something that actually is fun and teaches where the learner doesn't feel like they were in some program or being, that it didn't feel like work. It didn't feel like class. It felt like fun. It felt, you know, uh, refreshing and rewarding, right? So I think that's what we all kind of strive for. But I do want to bring our discussion to a close, and I want to ask you one more thing as we kind of wrap this up. For the L&D professionals that are out there, certainly they've had a lot to chew on from your responses so far. But what I was thinking, what would be a good way for those people who are watching to kind of assess what they've built so far? What are some ways that they can get some perhaps feedback from learners or assess their programs and try to better understand the current state of what they've built so that they can focus on learner engagement and say, let's see if we can build something a little bit better, or can we maybe bake in some more engagement along the way and improve that experience so that they feel better about what they're getting. And I'm just kind of curious, what are some things that we can leave the professionals with as they close out this recording here?
Okay, personal opinion. I think the thing that's going to make the biggest difference between unengaging experiences and engaging experiences is the practice. Upfront, hook them emotionally. Do address that. But then make sure your practice is tuned properly. Make sure that they are doing things in the practice that are things they'll have to accomplish in the real world after the learning experience. Put them in interesting stories. Don't just have stock cardboard cutout characters. Give them a little depth. Write more background for this person than actually shows up in the game or in the learning experience. In this case, it seems like unnecessary work, but it gives some richness to the character and motivation that helps establish that they're not just dumb or evil or bad, but they're interesting. And the world is complex, and it helps them recognize that and gives them a way to make it happen. So there's a lot of nuances, but just making sure your practice is in a good setting with that right level of challenge. And you have a sequence of context that they recognize will cover the space they need to transfer to and increase the level of challenge and complexity at the appropriate level for them. I think if you just focus on making the practice better, you're going to go a long way towards both making it more effective and more engaging.
I love that. Sounds like go a little deeper. Go a little deeper, provide a little something deeper for your learners, and the experience will deepen as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
I love it. Well, Dr. Quinn, thank you so much for joining us. Once again, Dr. Clark Quinn, and we can learn more about you from your website, right? Quinnovation.com?
Quinnovation.com, which also has a link to my blog. Thoughts that end up appearing in books and presentation stuff tend to show up there first. So learnlets.com. I'm involved in a couple other things. The L&D Accelerator is an evidence-based society for L&D practices. And I'm an advisor to Elevator 9, which is still in development. So no further reason to mention it yet, but hopefully soon. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity. And I really hope your audiences will take this opportunity to make experiences better for their learners and raise everybody's game.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching this episode of the L&D Explorers podcast. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe because more episodes are on the way. And no matter what your learning and development goals are, GoSkills can help. Click the link in the description to find out more. And thanks again for watching.